Have you ever worked in one of those gleaming corporate towers where the elevators move so fast your ears pop, and everyone around you seems to belong to a different universe entirely? Lauren Castellano knew that feeling intimately as she stepped through the revolving glass doors of Santangelo and Associates at exactly 7:15 every morning, 90 minutes before anyone else dared to arrive. The law firm occupied 3 floors of Manhattan's most prestigious business district, and Lauren had learned every inch of it during her 18 months as executive assistant to the managing partner. She moved through the empty corridors like a ghost, her sensible flats silent against marble floors that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Her reflection in the polished surfaces showed exactly what she expected. A 26-year-old woman in a conservative gray suit that fit reasonably well but would never be mistaken for designer. Dark hair pulled back in the same efficient bun she wore every day. Minimal makeup that somehow made her look younger rather than more professional. Lauren had perfected the art of invisibility in corporate America. She knew which coffee shops opened earliest, so she could have Marco Santangelo's perfectly prepared espresso waiting on his desk when he arrived. She understood exactly how he liked his schedule organized, which clients required delicate handling, and when his mood demanded, she postponed non-essential meetings. After 18 months of studying him like a fascinating subject, she could predict his needs better than he could himself. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become an expert on a man who barely seemed to notice she existed as anything more than an efficient piece of office equipment. Marco was everything Lauren had never dared to dream about. Tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of presence that made other men step aside instinctively. Dark hair always perfectly styled, and sharp green eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore suits that probably cost more than Lauren's monthly rent, spoke 4 languages fluently, and commanded respect from judges and senators with equal ease. Lauren had been arranging files in the conference room when she first heard the rumors about Marco's family connections. The senior partners spoke in careful whispers about the Santangelo name carrying weight beyond their legal reputation, about clients who paid enormous retainers for services that weren't entirely outlined in standard contracts. She'd learned to keep her expression neutral when phones rang at odd hours, or when certain visitors arrived through private entrances she wasn't supposed to know existed. Whatever Marco's family business involved beyond legitimate law practice, Lauren found herself drawn to his complex character rather than frightened by it. She'd watched him negotiate million-dollar settlements with ruthless precision, then personally deliver flowers to elderly clients in the hospital. She'd seen him reduce opposing counsel to trembling with barely controlled anger, then spend an hour patiently helping a paralegal understand complex filing procedures. He was dangerous and gentle, calculating and generous, powerful and surprisingly lonely. The elevator chimed softly as Lauren reached the executive floor, her arms full of perfectly organized files and Marco's favorite breakfast pastry from the Italian bakery 6 blocks away. She'd learned he preferred simple cornetti with jam rather than the elaborate catered spreads most executives expected. These small observations felt like secrets she hoarded, proof that she understood him in ways others didn't. Blair Hamilton's laugh echoed from the reception area before Lauren could escape to Marco's office. Blair was everything Lauren wasn't. Tall where Lauren was petite, blonde where Lauren was brunette, confident where Lauren remained invisible. She wore designer clothes like armor and commanded attention simply by existing. As the senior paralegal, Blair technically ranked below Lauren in the office hierarchy, but her connections and attitude made everyone forget that detail quickly. Blair appeared in the hallway like a model stepping off a magazine cover, her emerald green dress hugging every curve while somehow remaining appropriately professional. Her smile was brilliant and sharp as she looked Lauren up and down with practiced assessment. "You're here early again," Blair said, her tone carrying just enough concern to mask the criticism. "Don't you have anything better to do than live at the office?" Lauren shifted the files in her arms, feeling suddenly aware of her plain appearance next to Blair's polished perfection. Someone has to make sure everything runs smoothly when Marco arrives. Blair's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, Lauren, your little crush is so obvious it's almost painful to watch. Everyone can see how you moon over him during meetings." Heat flooded Lauren's cheeks as she glanced around the empty hallway, grateful no one else was present to witness her humiliation. I don't know what you mean. Of course you do, Blair continued, moving closer with predatory grace. You think I haven't noticed how you arrange his schedule to give yourself excuses to interrupt his meetings? How you always volunteer for overtime when he's working late? How you practically melt when he says thank you? Lauren's mouth went dry as she realized her carefully hidden feelings weren't nearly as secret as she'd believed. The files felt heavy in her arms as Blair's words confirmed her worst fears about transparency. Blair's expression softened into something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so cruel. Listen, I'm telling you this as a friend. Marco Santangelo is completely out of your league. Look at him, then look at yourself. He's Manhattan royalty, and well, you're sweet, but you're nobody special. He dates models and socialites, and women whose shoes cost more than your monthly salary. The words hit Lauren like physical blows, each one confirming insecurities she'd been fighting for months. She'd known the attraction was hopeless, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her chest tighten with familiar shame. You're not his type, Lauren, Blair said with devastating certainty. He'd never look at you twice. Men like Marco choose women like me, not mice like you. He needs someone who can match his sophistication, who belongs in his world naturally. Someone who enhances his image rather than diminishing it. Lauren stood frozen as Blair's assessment echoed everything she'd feared about herself. She was ordinary in every way that mattered in Marco's universe. Middle-class background, state school education, second-hand professional wardrobe, and social skills learned from etiquette books rather than inherited through generations. The elevator chimed again, and Lauren felt her heart stop as Marco's voice carried down the hallway. He was early, arriving before she'd had time to prepare his office properly or recover from Blair's crushing evaluation. Oh, perfect, Blair whispered, immediately straightening her dress and checking her reflection in the glass wall. Watch how a real woman handles this. Lauren pressed herself against the wall as Marco appeared, looking devastating in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the morning wind, and his green eyes held the alertness that made him such a formidable attorney. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted from life. Good morning, Marco, Blair purred, positioning herself directly in his path with a smile that could have powered the building. Marco nodded politely at Blair before his gaze found Lauren against the wall. Morning, Lauren. You're here early again. Something warm unfurled in Lauren's chest at the way he said her name, as if it mattered to him. Just making sure everything's ready for your day, she managed. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, and Lauren could have sworn she saw something like appreciation there. Thank you. That's exactly why this place runs so smoothly. Blair stepped closer to Marco, practically glowing with confidence. I was just telling Lauren how dedicated she is. Some people live for their work, don't they? Marco's expression shifted slightly as he glanced between them, and Lauren wondered if he could sense the undercurrent of tension. Indeed, dedication is a rare quality. Lauren watched as Blair launched into animated conversation about weekend plans and social events, her body language screaming availability, while Marco responded with polite but distant courtesy. She told herself she was imagining the way his attention seemed to drift toward her, the way his responses to Blair remained professional rather than personal. I should get your office ready, Lauren said quietly, clutching the files like a shield. Of course, Marco replied, and Lauren could have sworn his voice warmed slightly. I'll be there in a moment. Lauren escaped to Marco's office, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged his desk and tried to process Blair's brutal honesty. Everything her friend had said was true. Marco was sophisticated and powerful and devastatingly attractive, while Lauren was ordinary and invisible and completely wrong for someone like him. But as she placed his perfectly prepared espresso on the leather desk pad, Lauren couldn't quite silence the tiny voice in her head that whispered about the way Marco's eyes had found hers so quickly, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name, the appreciation in his expression when he thanked her. Maybe Blair was right about everything. Maybe Lauren was deluding herself about meaningless professional courtesy. But as she heard his footsteps approaching in the hallway, she couldn't help hoping that sometimes the impossible might be possible after all. The Martinelli meeting was scheduled for 10:30, and Lauren could see disaster approaching like a slow-motion train wreck. The Italian textile magnate had flown in specifically to discuss a complex international acquisition that required perfect coordination between multiple departments. But somehow the quarterly reports he'd requested had gone missing from the conference room. Lauren discovered the crisis at 10:15 when she performed her final check of the meeting materials. The reports should have been delivered by the research department the previous afternoon, but they were nowhere to be found. She could hear voices in the hallway as early arrivals began gathering, and panic fluttered in her chest as she calculated how much this mistake could cost Marco's reputation. Moving with practiced efficiency, Lauren sprinted to the research floor and located the missing reports still sitting in someone's inbox, apparently forgotten in the rush of yesterday's deadlines. She commandeered the fastest printer in the building, collating and binding 12 copies while keeping one eye on the clock. By 10:28, she was arranging the perfectly organized reports at each seat just as Marco entered with their distinguished guest. Mr. Martinelli was exactly as imposing as his reputation suggested, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that came from controlling a business empire worth hundreds of millions. He spoke in rapid Italian with Marco, gesturing expressively as they discussed preliminary details. Lauren watched Marco's subtle relief when he noticed the reports waiting at each place setting, his green eyes finding hers across the room with unmistakable gratitude. The meeting proceeded flawlessly for 40 minutes until senior partner James Crawford decided to demonstrate his authority by questioning Lauren's presence in the room. She was taking detailed notes for the follow-up correspondence when Crawford's voice cut across the discussion like a blade. "Perhaps we should have qualified personnel handling these sensitive documents," Crawford suggested with a pointed look at Lauren. "International acquisitions require a certain level of expertise that administrative staff might not possess." Lauren felt heat flood her cheeks as every face in the room turned toward her. She began gathering her materials, assuming she was being dismissed, when Marco's voice stopped her movement entirely. "Lauren stays," Marco said firmly, his tone carrying an edge that made Crawford shift uncomfortably in his chair. "She organized this entire presentation, located the missing reports that someone else failed to deliver, and understands these contracts better than most attorneys I know. Mr. Martinelli, I'd like you to meet Lauren Castellano, my executive assistant and the person responsible for making this meeting possible." Mr. Martinelli rose from his chair with old-world courtesy, extending his hand to Lauren with genuine warmth. "Signorina Castellano, it is my pleasure. Marco has spoken of your exceptional abilities during our preliminary discussions. A man is only as strong as the team that supports him, and clearly he has chosen wisely." Lauren shook his hand with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by Marco's public defense of her competence and the respect in their client's manner. She caught Crawford's sour expression and realized that Marco had just elevated her status in front of one of their most important clients, making any future dismissal impossible without losing face. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of continued partnership. As the room emptied, Lauren began collecting materials while trying to process what had happened. Marco had defended her against a senior partner, praised her abilities publicly, and essentially declared her indispensable to their most valuable client. "You saved the day," Marco said quietly once they were alone in the conference room. "Crawford would have blamed me for the missing reports, but you made sure our client never knew there was a problem." Lauren looked up from the files she was organizing, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "It's my job to anticipate problems. Is it your job to work miracles?" he asked, moving closer until she could smell his expensive cologne and see the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Because finding those reports in 15 minutes qualified as miraculous." For a moment, they stood closer than professional propriety suggested, and Lauren felt her breath catch as Marco's attention focused entirely on her. She wondered if he could hear her heart hammering against her ribs, if he noticed the way her hands shook slightly when he looked at her like that. The conference room door opened with Blair's distinctive laugh preceding her entrance. She swept into the room like a fashion magazine come to life, wearing a burgundy dress that emphasized every curve and left little to the imagination. Her smile was brilliant as she approached them, seemingly oblivious to the intimate moment she'd interrupted. "Marco, darling," Blair said, moving close enough to place her hand on his arm with familiar ease. I heard the Martinelli meeting went wonderfully. You must be exhausted from all that negotiating. Lauren watched Marco's expression shift, noting how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Blair touched him. He stepped back slightly, creating distance that Blair either didn't notice or chose to ignore. The meeting went smoothly thanks to Lauren's preparation, Marco replied, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been moments earlier. Blair's smile never wavered, but Lauren caught the flash of irritation in her eyes. Of course, Lauren is so dedicated to her work. I was wondering if you might be free for dinner tonight. There's a new restaurant in Soho that everyone's talking about, and I thought you might enjoy something sophisticated. Marco's discomfort was subtle but unmistakable to Lauren, who had spent months learning to read his expressions. He glanced toward Lauren before responding, and she could have sworn she saw something like regret in his eyes. I appreciate the invitation, but I'll be working late tonight, Marco said diplomatically. These international contracts require careful review. Blair's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. You work too hard. Surely you can spare one evening for proper relaxation with someone who understands your world. Lauren felt suddenly invisible again as Blair positioned herself between them, effectively cutting her out of the conversation. She gathered the remaining files and began moving toward the door, but Marco's voice stopped her. Lauren, could you prepare the Martinelli correspondence for my review this afternoon? Your notes were exceptionally detailed. Of course, Lauren replied, ignoring Blair's sharp look of annoyance. I'll have everything ready within the hour. As Lauren left the conference room, she heard Blair's voice dropping to what she probably thought was a seductive whisper. You're so demanding of your staff, Marco. Perhaps you need someone to help you unwind after all that intensity. Lauren didn't wait to hear Marco's response, but she noticed that he appeared in her office 20 minutes later with coffee from the expensive shop downstairs, the kind that cost $12 per cup and required advance ordering. For the Martinelli miracle, he said, placing the coffee on her desk with a smile that made her stomach flutter. And for putting up with Crawford's nonsense. You didn't have to do that, Lauren said, touched by the gesture despite herself. Marco lingered by her desk longer than necessary, his attention focused on her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. Tell me something, Lauren. Where did you learn to handle complex international law? Your notes showed understanding that most paralegals don't possess. Lauren felt surprise at his personal interest, the way he asked as if her background genuinely mattered to him. I studied international business before switching to general studies. My family immigrated from Italy when I was 12, so I grew up translating contracts for my father's restaurant. Marco's eyes brightened with unexpected interest. Which region of Italy? Tuscany, a small village outside Florence that you've probably never heard of. Try me, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, as if he had all the time in the world for this conversation. For the next 30 minutes, they discussed Italian culture, family traditions, and shared experiences of maintaining connections to homeland while building American lives. Lauren found herself relaxing as Marco listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions about her family and background. She'd never had a conversation this personal with him, never seen him show interest in anyone's life beyond professional requirements. Their discussion was interrupted when Blair appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension radiating from her posture. Marco, your 2 o'clock appointment has arrived. Marco glanced at his watch with apparent surprise, as if he'd forgotten time existed during their conversation. Thank you, Blair. Lauren, we should continue this discussion soon. I'd like to hear more about your father's restaurant. After Marco left, Blair remained in Lauren's office, her friendly facade dropping like a discarded mask. You're playing a dangerous game, she said quietly. I'm not playing any game, Lauren replied, her heart still racing for Marco's unexpected attention. Blair's laugh was sharp with disbelief. Please, that little performance about Italy and family history? You're trying to create connections that don't exist, Lauren. Marco was being polite, nothing more. Lauren wanted to argue, to defend the genuine interest she'd seen in Marco's eyes, but Blair's confidence shook her resolve. Maybe she had been reading too much into professional courtesy, seeing romance where only politeness existed. He asked about everyone's background eventually. Blair continued with cruel certainty. It's part of his management style, making employees feel valued. Don't mistake professional attention for personal interest. But as Lauren sat alone in her office later that afternoon, She found an envelope on her desk that hadn't been there before. Inside was a gift card to the Italian bakery where she bought Marco's morning pastries, along with a handwritten note that made her breath catch. "Thank you for everything you do. Your dedication doesn't go unnoticed." Lauren stared at the note until the words blurred, wondering if professional courtesy included personal gift cards and handwritten acknowledgments. She thought about the way Marco had defended her against Crawford, the genuine interest in his questions about her family, the warmth in his voice when he spoke her name. Maybe Blair was right about everything. Maybe Lauren was desperately misinterpreting simple kindness as something more meaningful. But as she tucked the note carefully into her purse, she couldn't quite silence the hope blooming in her chest that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as everyone believed. Blair's announcement echoed through the break room like a declaration of war. She stood beside the coffee machine with the confidence of a queen addressing her subjects, her red dress commanding attention from every person within earshot. "I've decided to ask Marco to the Children's Hospital Charity Gala next Friday," Blair said, examining her perfectly manicured nails with satisfaction. "It's the social event of the season, and obviously he'll need an appropriate companion who can represent the firm properly." Lauren kept her eyes focused on her lunch, trying to make herself invisible while her stomach twisted with something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. The gala was indeed Manhattan's most prestigious charity event, where senators and Supreme Court justices mingled with business royalty under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars. "Of course, not everyone understands that level of sophistication," Blair continued, her gaze sliding meaningfully toward Lauren's corner table. "Some people might think a charity gala is just dinner and dancing, but it's actually about networking with New York's most influential families. You need someone who naturally belongs in that world." Lauren forced herself to take another bite of her sandwich, even though it now tasted like cardboard mixed with humiliation. Everything Blair said was absolutely true. The gala required social skills Lauren had never learned, designer gowns she couldn't afford, and confidence she'd never possessed. Marco would need someone who enhanced his reputation rather than embarrassing him in front of clients and colleagues. The conversations around the break room gradually resumed, but Lauren caught several glances in her direction, knowing that everyone was thinking exactly what Blair had articulated so perfectly. She was nobody special, while Blair was everything a successful man like Marco should want in a companion. Lauren escaped to her desk with relief, grateful for the familiar comfort of organized files and ringing phones. She was reviewing contract amendments when Marco's voice carried from his office, the door slightly ajar as he spoke on a conference call. His tone held unusual irritation, and Lauren found herself unconsciously listening despite her better judgment. "I appreciate your daughter's interest, but I've already explained that I prefer to keep business and personal relationships separate," Marco was saying with barely contained impatience. "Honestly, James, I'm getting tired of women who think persistence equals charm. When someone shows no interest, continuing to pursue them becomes harassment rather than flattery." Lauren's fingers stilled on her keyboard as she realized Marco was speaking to James Crawford about someone's romantic pursuit. Her heart hammered as she wondered if he was referring to Blair's obvious campaign for his attention. "Some women don't understand subtle rejection," Marco continued, his voice carrying the edge that appeared when he was genuinely annoyed. "They mistake professional courtesy for personal interest, then become increasingly aggressive when their advances aren't reciprocated. It's exhausting to constantly deflect unwanted attention while trying to maintain workplace harmony." Lauren felt something like hope blooming in her chest as she processed Marco's words. He sounded frustrated with aggressive pursuit, tired of women who wouldn't accept his polite distance. Maybe Blair's confidence was misplaced after all. The quarterly associates party that Friday evening transformed the law firm's conference room into something resembling elegant socializing, though Lauren suspected most attendees were there for the premium open bar rather than voluntary office bonding. She wore her nicest black dress, simple but well-fitted, and arrived precisely at the announced start time like the dedicated employee she was. Blair made her entrance 30 minutes later, fashionably late in a stunning emerald gown that probably cost more than Lauren's monthly rent. She swept through the room like royalty greeting subjects, but her attention remained laser-focused on Marco's location near the windows overlooking the city skyline. Lauren positioned herself at a small table in the corner, nursing a glass of wine and watching the social dynamics unfold with anthropological fascination. She observed Blair gradually working her way across the room toward Marco, stopping to chat with colleagues, but clearly maintaining her target in peripheral vision. Marco looked devastating in his dark suit, commanding attention simply by existing as several junior associates competed for his notice. He responded to everyone with professional courtesy, but Lauren noticed his attention seemed scattered, his gaze occasionally sweeping the room as if searching for something specific. Blair finally reached Marco's group, inserting herself into their conversation with practiced ease. Lauren watched from across the room as Blair positioned her body language to suggest intimate familiarity, touching Marco's arm during conversation and laughing with sparkling enthusiasm at everything he said. But something felt wrong with Blair's performance. Marco's responses remained polite but distant, his body language creating subtle barriers despite Blair's obvious availability. He stepped back when she moved closer, redirected conversations when they became too personal, and maintained eye contact for shorter periods than Blair clearly expected. Lauren was observing this complex social chess game when Marco's gaze suddenly found hers across the crowded room. Their eyes met for several heartbeats, and Lauren felt her breath catch as something like relief flickered across his expression. He excused himself from Blair's group with smooth diplomacy and began moving through the crowd in Lauren's direction. "You're hiding in the corner," Marco said as he approached her table, his voice carrying warmth that made her skin tingle. "That's not very festive for a party." "I'm observing," Lauren replied, surprised by her own boldness. Social dynamics are fascinating when you watch from the outside. Marco's smile was genuine as he settled into the chair beside her, angling his body so they could speak privately despite the crowd around them. "And what have you observed about tonight's dynamics?" Lauren glanced toward Blair, who was watching their interaction with barely concealed frustration. "That some people are working very hard to achieve specific outcomes, while others are just trying to survive the evening." Marco followed her gaze, and something like amusement flickered in his green eyes. "Survival is an interesting way to describe workplace socializing. Do you feel like you're in danger?" "Only from terminal boredom," Lauren said, then immediately wondered where that wit had come from. She'd never bantered with Marco before, never felt confident enough to risk humor that might fall flat. Marco laughed, a rich sound that made several heads turn in their direction. "I was hoping to escape the boredom myself." "Have you traveled much, Lauren? You mentioned your family was from Italy." For the next 40 minutes, they discussed travel and books and cultural differences with the kind of easy conversation Lauren had never imagined possible between them. Marco listened with genuine attention as she described family trips to Tuscany, asked thoughtful questions about her favorite authors, and shared stories about his own experiences in Europe that revealed unexpected depth beneath his professional facade. Lauren became so absorbed in their conversation that she forgot about the party around them, forgot about Blair's increasing agitation, forgot about all the reasons why a man like Marco shouldn't be interested in talking with someone like her. She felt witty and intelligent and genuinely engaging for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Their discussion was interrupted when Blair appeared beside their table with 2 fresh drinks and a smile that could have cut glass. "Marco, I brought you a whiskey," Blair said, setting the glass down with slightly more force than necessary. "I thought you might be getting thirsty." "Thank you, but I'm fine with water tonight," Marco replied without taking the offered drink. Blair's smile flickered as she realized her gesture had been rejected. "Lauren, you look tired," Blair continued, her tone dripping with false concern. "Perhaps you should head home early. These long days must be exhausting for someone who works so many extra hours." Lauren felt heat flood her cheeks as Blair's dismissal registered, the subtle implication that she didn't belong at social events with more important people. She began to stand, ready to make her excuses and flee, when Marco's hand touched her arm gently. "Actually, we were just discussing Renaissance art museums," Marco said firmly, his attention remaining focused on Lauren. "You were saying that the Uffizi Gallery changed your perspective on classical sculpture?" Lauren settled back into her chair, grateful beyond words for Marco's intervention and the way he'd ignored Blair's obvious attempt to remove her from the conversation. For another 20 minutes, they continued talking while Blair stood beside their table like an increasingly frustrated statue, unable to insert herself into their discussion without appearing rude. Eventually, Blair excused herself with icy politeness, but Lauren caught the murderous look she directed toward her before stalking away across the room. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of easy conversation and growing connection that left Lauren wondering if she'd somehow stepped into an alternate universe where impossible things became possible. The party was winding down when disaster struck with the kind of sudden violence that changed everything in an instant. Lauren was heading toward the ladies' room when her heel caught in a loose carpet edge near the main staircase. She felt herself falling backward toward the marble stairs, time slowing as she realized the fall could be seriously dangerous from this height. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, pulling her firmly against a solid chest as Marco's cologne surrounded her like a protective cloud. His grip was sure and warm, holding her steady while her heart hammered against her ribs from shock and sudden proximity. "Are you hurt?" Marco asked, his voice tight with concern as his hands moved over her arms and shoulders, checking for injury with gentle thoroughness. "Did you twist anything? Hit your head?" "I'm fine," Lauren breathed, though she was trembling from the near miss and the overwhelming sensation of being held against Marco's chest. "Thank you for catching me." Marco didn't release her immediately, his arms remaining around her as if he was reluctant to let her go. Several people had stopped to stare at the scene, and Lauren was dimly aware of Blair watching from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're shaking," Marco said quietly, his hands rubbing her arms with gentle warmth. "Let me drive you home. You shouldn't be alone after something like that." "That's not necessary," Lauren protested weakly, though every cell in her body was screaming for her to accept his offer. "It's completely necessary," Marco replied with the kind of authority that ended arguments. "You could be in shock. I'm not letting you get into a taxi while you're trembling." Lauren found herself in the passenger seat of Marco's sleek black BMW 20 minutes later, the leather interior still holding the warmth of his body and the subtle scent of his cologne. The city lights blurred past the windows as they drove toward her apartment in comfortable silence. "Thank you for tonight," Lauren said as they pulled up outside her building. "For the conversation, I mean. And for catching me." Marco turned to face her in the dim light from the dashboard, his green eyes serious as they searched her expression. "Thank you for reminding me that intelligent conversation still exists. Tonight was the most genuine human interaction I've had in months." Lauren felt her breath catch at the sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her as if she was someone worth remembering. For a moment, she almost believed that Blair's harsh assessment might be wrong, that maybe she was worth Marco's attention after all. But as she watched his expensive car disappear into the night, doubt crept back into her thoughts. Maybe tonight had been an aberration, a moment of kindness that meant nothing beyond professional courtesy. Maybe Blair was right about everything, and Lauren was desperately misinterpreting simple politeness as something more significant. Yet she couldn't forget the way Marco's arms had felt around her, the genuine warmth in his voice when he thanked her for conversation, the relief that had flickered across his expression when their eyes met across the crowded room. For the first time in months, Lauren fell asleep wondering if impossible things might sometimes become possible after all. The annual Santangelo and Associates Awards dinner was Manhattan legal society at its most glittering, held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel with enough crystal and gold leaf to make Versailles jealous. Lauren stood in her apartment bedroom, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror she'd borrowed from her neighbor, wondering what cosmic joke had convinced her to attend an event where she would be so obviously out of place. Her dress was simple black crepe, the nicest thing she owned but purchased from a department store rather than a designer boutique. She'd styled her dark hair in a low chignon that felt elegant until she imagined it beside the professionally crafted updos that would surround her all evening. Her makeup was carefully applied but subtle, highlighting her natural features rather than creating the dramatic glamour expected at such events. Lauren had debated skipping the dinner entirely, claiming illness or family emergency, but something stubborn inside her refused to hide from Blair's inevitable triumph. If tonight was the evening when Marco publicly chose his sophisticated companion for future social events, Lauren wanted to witness it with dignity rather than hear about it secondhand through office gossip. The plaza's opulent lobby buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as Manhattan's legal elite gathered for their annual celebration of professional achievement and social positioning. Lauren recognized judges and politicians from newspaper photos, business leaders whose names appeared on skyscrapers throughout the city, and socialites whose charitable activities were regularly featured in glossy magazines. She felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture as she made her way through the crowd, noting the casual way attendees discussed multi-million-dollar cases and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Everyone seemed to belong here naturally, wearing their wealth and status like comfortable clothing that fit perfectly. Blair's entrance 20 minutes later proved that Lauren's simple black dress had been the correct choice for completely wrong reasons. Blair wore a stunning silver gown that caught the light with every movement, cut to showcase her perfect figure while remaining appropriately elegant for the formal occasion. Diamonds sparkled at her throat and ears, and her blonde hair was arranged in an intricate updo that must have required professional styling. She moved through the ballroom like a queen accepting homage, stopping to air-kiss society matrons and exchange pleasantries with senior partners' wives. Lauren watched from her corner table, assigned seating that placed her with junior staff rather than the prestigious head tables where partners and their companions would be prominently displayed. Marco appeared near the bar looking devastating in black tie, his dark hair perfectly styled and his green eyes surveying the room with the confidence of a man completely comfortable in environments that intimidated lesser mortals. Several women approached him within minutes of his arrival, each finding excuses to touch his arm or position themselves within his personal space. Lauren observed his responses with the expertise of 18 months spent learning his expressions and body language. He was politely distant with everyone, engaging in conversation without encouraging deeper connection. When Blair finally reached him near the champagne fountain, Lauren braced herself for the inevitable display of Blair's social superiority. But something felt wrong with the interaction, even from across the crowded ballroom. Marco's smile remained professional rather than welcoming as Blair moved close enough to suggest intimate familiarity. When she touched his arm during conversation, he stepped back subtly but definitively. Their exchange lasted only a few minutes before Marco excused himself with smooth diplomacy, leaving Blair standing alone beside the champagne fountain with an expression Lauren had never seen before: uncertainty. The formal dinner portion of the evening began with perfectly orchestrated precision as waiters served courses that probably cost more than Lauren's monthly rent. She found herself seated between a junior paralegal who spent the entire soup course complaining about his student loans and a court reporter who discussed her recent divorce with uncomfortable frankness. Lauren was picking at her perfectly prepared salmon when she noticed unusual activity at the head table where Marco sat with senior partners and their distinguished guests. James Crawford appeared to be having an animated discussion with someone Lauren couldn't see, gesturing in her direction with obvious agitation. Then everything changed with the kind of dramatic suddenness that transforms ordinary moments into life-altering memories. Marco stood from his place at the head table, his tall figure commanding immediate attention from everyone in the ballroom. He moved through the room with purposeful strides that suggested serious intention rather than casual socializing. Lauren felt her breath stop as she realized Marco was walking directly toward her table, his green eyes focused entirely on her face with an intensity that made conversations around them gradually fade into silence. The junior paralegal beside her stopped mid-sentence about his legal brief, following Lauren's stunned gaze toward the approaching figure. Blair rose from her seat several tables away, clearly expecting Marco to stop and request her company at the head table as they'd all anticipated. Her confident smile faltered when Marco walked past her without acknowledgement, continuing his determined path toward Lauren's corner of the ballroom. "Lauren," Marco said as he reached her table, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over nearby conversations. "Would you join me at the head table? There's an empty seat beside mine, and I'd very much like your company for the remainder of the evening." The ballroom seemed to freeze as I turned toward Lauren, registering Marco's public request with shock and fascination. She sat motionless for several heartbeats, certain she'd misunderstood or that this was some elaborate mistake that would be corrected momentarily. "I don't think I belong at the head table," Lauren whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. Marco's smile was warm and genuine as he extended his hand toward her with old-fashioned gallantry. "You belong wherever I want you to be. And right now, that's beside me." Lauren accepted his offered hand with trembling fingers, rising from her chair, while acutely aware that several hundred of Manhattan's most influential people were watching her every movement. Marco's hand was warm and steady as he guided her through the ballroom, past tables full of stunned colleagues and competitors who were rapidly revising their assumptions about invisible assistants and powerful men. Blair stood frozen beside her abandoned table as they passed, her perfect composure cracking for the first time since Lauren had known her. The confident smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by an expression of shocked disbelief that would have been satisfying if Lauren hadn't been too terrified to enjoy it properly. The head table buzzed with poorly concealed curiosity as Marco settled Lauren in the chair beside his, immediately introducing her to Supreme Court Justice Patricia Henley and Senator Robert Walsh, as if presenting a treasured companion rather than apologizing for an awkward mistake. "Gentlemen, ladies, I'd like you to meet Lauren Castellano," Marco said with obvious pride, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture that suggested possession and protection simultaneously. "She's my executive assistant and the woman who makes my professional life possible. Without her exceptional abilities, none of us would be here celebrating another successful year." Justice Henley extended her hand with genuine warmth, her sharp eyes assessing Lauren with the kind of attention usually reserved for potential Supreme Court clerks. "Ms. Castellano, Marco has mentioned your remarkable organizational skills and legal insight during our previous conversations. It's a pleasure to finally meet the woman behind his recent successes." Lauren shook the justice's hand with growing amazement, realizing that Marco had spoken about her to some of the most powerful people in American jurisprudence. He'd been noticing her work, valuing her contributions, and sharing that recognition with influential colleagues while she'd been convinced of her own invisibility. Senator Walsh engaged her in conversation about international trade law that revealed Marco had indeed been correct about her understanding of complex legal concepts. As the evening progressed, Lauren found herself relaxing despite the surreal circumstances, discovering that Supreme Court justices and federal senators were simply intelligent people who appreciated thoughtful conversation. Marco remained beside her throughout dinner, his attention focused on her responses and comfort level with an intensity that made her skin warm. He anticipated her needs before she recognized them herself, ensuring her water glass stayed filled and that she was included in every conversation without being pressured to perform beyond her comfort zone. The formal awards presentation began after dessert, with various partners receiving recognition for landmark cases and professional achievements. Lauren was applauding politely when Marco's name was called for the prestigious Attorney of the Year award, recognizing his exceptional work on the international acquisitions that had elevated the firm's global reputation. Marco rose to accept his crystal trophy with characteristic grace, moving to the podium with confident strides that emphasized his commanding presence. His acceptance speech was brief and professional until the final paragraph, when his eyes found Lauren's across the crowded ballroom. "Finally, I want to acknowledge the person who made this recognition possible," Marco said, his voice carrying clearly through the excellent sound system. "Lauren Castellano has been my partner in every sense except the legal one, anticipating problems before they arise, organizing complex negotiations with remarkable skill, and providing the foundation that allows me to focus on strategy rather than details. This award belongs to both of us." The ballroom erupted in polite applause, but Lauren barely heard it over the rushing in her ears as Marco's public recognition washed over her like warm sunlight. He'd called her his partner in front of Manhattan's legal establishment, credited her with his professional success, and claimed their collaboration as the foundation of his achievements. As Marco returned to his seat beside her, Lauren felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in his world. She wasn't invisible after all, wasn't insignificant, or easily replaceable. She was valuable, competent, and worthy of recognition from a man whose opinion mattered to everyone in this glittering ballroom. The evening's triumph was interrupted when Blair appeared beside their table during the networking hour that followed a Ward's presentation, her silver gown catching the light as she positioned herself between Lauren and the ongoing conversation. Her smile was brilliant and sharp as broken glass, her eyes holding something that might have been desperation beneath the polished surface. "Marco, what a lovely surprise to see Lauren here tonight," Blair said with false warmth that didn't quite mask the venom underneath. "I had no idea she was interested in legal society events. Perhaps she's hoping to meet some eligible bachelors among the junior associates." Lauren felt heat flood her cheeks as Blair's implication registered. The suggestion that she was using the formal dinner as a hunting ground for male attention rather than belonging there on her own merits. Marco's expression shifted dangerously, his green eyes turning cold as winter as he registered Blair's deliberate insult. "Actually, Blair, Lauren is here because I specifically requested her company for the evening. She belongs at this table more than most people in this room." Blair's laugh was crystalline and cruel as she pressed forward with her attack, clearly believing that public humiliation would eliminate Lauren as competition permanently. "Oh, Marco, you're so generous to include your staff in social events. But surely you don't mean to suggest that Lauren actually belongs among Manhattan's legal elite? She's a lovely girl, but there are certain standards expected at these gatherings." The temperature around their table seemed to drop several degrees as Marco rose from his chair, his full height emphasizing the power and authority that made opposing counsel nervous in courtrooms across the city. His voice remained perfectly controlled, but Lauren could hear the steel underneath that suggested Blair had made a serious miscalculation. "Let me clarify something for you, Blair," Marco said with deadly quiet that made nearby conversation stop entirely. "Lauren Castellano possesses more intelligence, grace, and natural class than half the people in this ballroom combined. She understands complex international law better than most partners, speaks 3 languages fluently, and has the kind of authentic elegance that can't be purchased with designer gowns or inherited through family connections." Blair's confident expression began to crumble as Marco continued his devastating assessment, each word precisely chosen to dismantle her assumptions about social hierarchy and personal worth. Furthermore, Marco continued, his attention never wavering from Blair's increasingly pale face, "Lauren has never needed to insert herself into conversations where she wasn't wanted, never required aggressive pursuit to gain male attention, and never confused professional courtesy with personal interest. Perhaps you should consider why some approaches succeed while others fail so spectacularly." The public destruction was swift and complete, delivered with the kind of legal precision that had made Marco's reputation in courtrooms where careers lived and died based on the strength of arguments. Blair stood speechless for several heartbeats, her perfect composure finally shattered as the reality of her situation penetrated her shock. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Blair said weakly, but Marco had already dismissed her from his attention as completely as if she'd ceased to exist. "No misunderstanding at all," Marco replied, settling back into his chair beside Lauren with protective authority that made his preferences absolutely clear. "Now if you'll excuse us, Lauren and I were enjoying a private conversation." Blair retreated from their table with whatever dignity remained intact, but Lauren caught the murderous look she directed toward her before disappearing into the crowd. The confrontation had been witnessed by enough people to ensure that Monday morning would bring dramatically shifted office dynamics and revised assumptions about invisible assistants and powerful men. As the evening wound down and couples began making gracious exits, Marco helped Lauren retrieve her simple black coat from the check station, his hand warm and steady on her back as they moved through the plaza's opulent lobby. "Thank you for tonight," Lauren said as they waited for the valet to bring Marco's car, still processing the complete transformation of her understanding about her place in his world. Marco turned to face her in the soft light from the hotel's crystal chandeliers, his green eyes serious as they searched her expression. "Thank you for reminding me what genuine connection feels like. I've been watching you for months, Lauren, admiring your intelligence and kindness while you convinced yourself you were invisible." Lauren felt tears prick her eyes as the full impact of his words registered. "You've been watching me?" Marco's smile was gentle and warm as he reached up to touch her cheek with careful tenderness. "Every day? The way you anticipate problems before they arise, The consideration you show to everyone regardless of their status. The quiet competence that makes impossible things seem effortless. You're extraordinary, Lauren, and I'm tired of pretending I haven't noticed. As Marco's expensive car pulled up outside the Plaza Hotel, Lauren realized that everything Blair had told her about her chances and her worth had been completely, spectacularly wrong. She wasn't invisible after all, wasn't insignificant or easily overlooked. She was seen, valued, and chosen by a man whose attention was coveted by half of Manhattan's eligible women. For the first time in her adult life, Lauren fell asleep that night believing she might actually be worth extraordinary love after all. The restaurant Marco chose for their first official date was nothing like Lauren had expected. Instead of the intimidating five-star establishments where Manhattan's elite typically conducted their romantic affairs, he brought her to a small family-owned Italian place in Little Italy that reminded her of her father's kitchen, with its warm lighting and the scent of garlic and fresh herbs hanging in the air. "We're not exactly dressed for this place," Lauren said with amusement as she looked around at the casual atmosphere, while wearing the emerald dress Marco had sent to her apartment that afternoon, along with a note saying he wanted to see her in something as beautiful as she was. Marco smiled as he helped her into her chair, looking perfectly comfortable despite his expensive suit among the checkered tablecloths and Chianti bottle candle holders. "The Rossini family has owned this place for 40 years. They knew my grandmother when she first came to America, and they still make the best osso buco in the city. Sometimes the most authentic experiences are found in the simplest places." Lauren felt something warm unfurl in her chest as she realized Marco had chosen intimacy over impression, sharing something personal rather than displaying his wealth and status. She watched him greet the elderly owner in fluid Italian, accepting enthusiastic embraces and inquiries about his family with genuine affection that revealed a softer side she'd never witnessed in the corporate environment. "You speak Italian beautifully," Lauren said as they settled at their corner table with wine that the owner had selected personally, insisting it was perfect for such a lovely couple. Marco's eyes warmed as he looked across the small table at her, the candlelight casting shadows that emphasized the strong lines of his jaw and the surprising gentleness in his expression. "My nana insisted we learn properly. She said we could live in America, but we must never forget where we came from. She would have liked you very much, Lauren." The conversation flowed as naturally as it had at the plaza, but without the pressure of public scrutiny and professional boundaries. Marco told her about his family's journey from Sicily to New York, how his grandfather had built a small construction company into a legitimate business empire through hard work and strategic partnerships that sometimes required navigating complex relationships with various neighborhood organizations. Lauren understood the careful way he described those early years, reading between the lines about the realities of building success in a world where business and family loyalties often overlapped in complicated ways. She appreciated his honesty about his family's past while focusing on their current legitimate enterprises in construction, real estate, and legal services. "My turn to share family secrets," Lauren said as the wine relaxed her inhibitions, and Marco's genuine interest made her feel safe enough to reveal vulnerabilities she'd never discussed with anyone. "My father worked 3 jobs to keep his restaurant open during my childhood. I spent every afternoon after school doing homework in the back booth while he taught me to read legal documents because he couldn't afford to hire help with contracts and permits." Marco listened with the same focused attention he brought to complex legal negotiations, asking thoughtful questions about her father's struggles and her role in helping the family navigate American bureaucracy despite her young age. She told him about translating for her parents during bank meetings, reviewing lease agreements when she was still in high school, and developing her understanding of business law through necessity rather than formal education. "That explains your intuitive understanding of international contracts," Marco said with admiration that made Lauren's cheeks warm. "You've been practicing law since you were 12 years old." The evening deepened into something more intimate as they shared stories about dreams deferred and responsibilities accepted, about the weight of family expectations and the courage required to build new identities while honoring old loyalties. Lauren found herself laughing more easily than she had in months, responding to Marco's dry humor and gentle teasing with wit she'd forgotten she possessed. When Marco walked her to her apartment building later that evening, Lauren felt transformed by more than just the expensive dress and professional hairstyling. She felt seen and valued and genuinely desired by a man whose attention was coveted by women far more sophisticated and accomplished than herself. "I have something to tell you about Monday," Marco said as they stood outside her building, his hands warm on her shoulders as he looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Blair submitted her resignation this morning, effective immediately. She's accepted a position with Crawford's former firm." Lauren felt surprise mixed with relief as the news registered. She wouldn't have to face Blair's humiliation and resentment every day, wouldn't have to navigate the awkward aftermath of such a public defeat. Part of her felt sorry for Blair's wounded pride, but a larger part was grateful for the elimination of constant competition and criticism. "There's something else," Marco continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone she recognized from important business discussions. "I'm promoting you to senior executive assistant with a substantial salary increase and expanded responsibilities. You'll be working directly with our international clients and handling contract negotiations that require your particular expertise." "Marco, I don't know if I'm qualified for that level of responsibility," Lauren said, her old insecurities surfacing despite the evening's confidence-building revelations. Marco's hands tightened slightly on her shoulders, his green eyes serious as they held her gaze. "You've been handling that level of responsibility for months without the recognition or compensation you deserved. The only difference will be the title and the paycheck that should have accompanied your contributions all along." Lauren felt tears prick her eyes as the full impact of his words registered. He wasn't just offering her professional advancement. He was acknowledging that her contributions had been undervalued and undercompensated, while she'd convinced herself she was lucky to have any job at all. Their first kiss happened naturally, without the dramatic build-up Lauren had imagined during countless private fantasies. Marco's hands came up to frame her face with gentle reverence, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones as he looked down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I've been wanting to do this since the first day you organized that impossible schedule and made me look competent in front of Senator Walsh," Marco said quietly, his voice rough with barely controlled desire. When his lips finally touched hers, Lauren felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of what desire could feel like when it was mutual and genuine rather than one-sided and hopeless. Marco kissed her slowly and thoroughly, as if he had all the time in the world to explore the connection that had been building between them for months. The following Monday morning brought a dramatically altered office landscape that reflected Lauren's transformed status in ways both subtle and profound. Her new office was larger and better positioned, with windows overlooking the city and furniture that suggested importance rather than invisibility. Her computer had been upgraded, her phone system expanded, and her business cards now read Senior Executive Assistant with contact information that would be distributed to international clients and government officials. More significant than the physical changes was the shift in how colleagues interacted with her. Junior associates who had never acknowledged her existence suddenly sought her input on complex cases. Senior partners included her in strategy meetings and deferred to her expertise on international protocols. The transformation from invisible support staff to valued team member was so complete that Lauren sometimes felt like she was living in an alternate universe. Marco's introduction of her to his family happened gradually and naturally, beginning with lunch at his mother's house the following Sunday. Sophia Santangelo was a small, elegant woman in her late 60s who possessed the kind of regal bearing that came from decades of managing a complex family and business empire with grace and intelligence. Lauren had expected to feel intimidated by Marco's mother, but Sophia's warmth and genuine interest made her feel welcomed rather than evaluated. They spent the afternoon in Sophia's herb garden, discussing cooking and family traditions while Sophia shared stories about Marco's childhood that revealed his protective instincts had been evident since he was young enough to defend stray animals from neighborhood bullies. "She likes you," Marco said as they drove back to Manhattan that evening, his hand covering hers on the center console with casual intimacy that still made Lauren's heart race. "Mama is very particular about the women I bring home, but she spent the entire afternoon teaching you her secret marinara recipe. That's family territory." Lauren felt something like awe as she processed the significance of Sophia's acceptance and the casual way Marco referred to family territory as if Lauren's inclusion was natural and inevitable rather than temporary and conditional. Their relationship deepened over the following weeks through a combination of professional partnership and personal intimacy that felt both thrilling and surprisingly natural. Lauren discovered that Marco's protective instincts extended far beyond business negotiations to include everything from ensuring she ate properly during long work days to positioning himself between her and potential threats when they walked city streets at night. The first time Marco stayed overnight at her apartment, Lauren felt nervous about the contrast between his luxury penthouse and her modest one-bedroom space with its secondhand furniture and limited amenities. But Marco moved through her small kitchen with easy comfort, cooking breakfast while wearing his dress shirt from the previous evening and looking perfectly content with her simple coffee maker and mismatched dishes. "You're thinking too loud," Marco said as he placed perfectly prepared eggs Benedict in front of her, using ingredients he'd somehow created from her nearly empty refrigerator. "Tell me what's worrying you." Lauren looked around her apartment through his eyes, seeing the worn couch and the water stain on the ceiling that her landlord kept promising to fix. "This isn't what you're used to. Your penthouse probably costs more per month than I make in a year." Marco sat beside her at the small table, his expression serious as he reached for her hands with gentle firmness. "I spent my childhood in a walk-up apartment smaller than this one, Lauren. My grandmother cooked Sunday dinners for 12 people in a kitchen half the size of yours. Luxury is pleasant, but it's not what makes a place feel like home." Their physical relationship developed with the same careful consideration Marco brought to every aspect of his life. He seemed to understand Lauren's inexperience without making her feel embarrassed about it, taking time to build her confidence and comfort level with patience that spoke of genuine caring rather than calculated seduction. When they finally became intimate completely, it happened in Lauren's apartment on a rainy Thursday evening, when work stress and accumulated desire finally overcame the last of her hesitations about deserving such happiness. Marco's tenderness and focus on her pleasure made Lauren understand why women wrote poetry about love and why people made life-altering decisions for the sake of physical and emotional connection. "You're extraordinary," Marco whispered against her hair as they lay tangled in her sheets afterward, his arms holding her close with protective possessiveness that made her feel cherished rather than owned. "Every day I discover something new about you that amazes me." Lauren pressed closer to his warmth, finally believing that she might actually deserve the happiness she'd found in his arms. For the first time in her adult life, she felt beautiful and desired and worthy of extraordinary love from an extraordinary man. The transformation was complete when Lauren looked in her bathroom mirror the following morning and saw a woman she barely recognized, confident and radiant and absolutely certain of her own worth. Marco's love had given her permission to see herself through his eyes, to believe that she was valuable and intelligent and beautiful enough to deserve everything she'd been afraid to want. As she prepared for another day as Marco's professional and personal partner, Lauren smiled at her reflection with genuine happiness. She was no longer invisible, no longer insignificant, no longer convinced she was lucky to accept whatever scraps of attention might fall her way. She was Lauren Castellano, senior executive assistant to one of Manhattan's most successful attorneys and the beloved girlfriend of a man who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. She was finally, completely, and confidently enough. 6 months later, Lauren stood in the same Plaza Hotel ballroom where her life had changed forever, but this time she belonged there completely. The Children's Hospital charity gala that Blair had once expected to attend as Marco's companion now showcased Lauren as his acknowledged partner, radiant in a custom-designed sapphire gown that complemented her dark hair and brought out the confidence that had transformed her from invisible to luminous. The difference was breathtaking. Lauren moved through the crowd with natural grace, engaging Supreme Court justices and federal senators in conversations about international law, while Marco watched with obvious pride from across the room. Her promotion to senior executive assistant had evolved into an unofficial partnership that made her indispensable to the firm's most complex negotiations, and her growing reputation in legal circles had earned invitations to speak at conferences about international contract law. Marco looked devastating in his black tie, commanding attention simply by existing as various dignitaries approached to discuss pending legislation and upcoming cases. But Lauren noticed how his gaze consistently found her throughout the evening, checking on her comfort and well-being with the protective instincts that had become second nature over the past months. Their relationship had deepened into something that felt both passionate and companionable, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than the desperate attraction Lauren had once imagined. Marco's family had embraced her completely, with his mother Sophia insisting Lauren call her mama, and including her in Sunday dinners where 3 generations gathered to argue about politics and share embarrassing childhood stories. Lauren's own family had been equally welcoming to Marco, though her father had initially been intimidated by his sophisticated appearance and expensive car. That awkwardness had disappeared the first time Marco spent an afternoon helping in the restaurant kitchen, rolling pasta with the same focused attention he brought to complex legal negotiations while listening to her father's stories about building a business in America. The evening's formal program began after dinner, with various speakers discussing the Children's Hospital's groundbreaking research and critical need for continued funding. Lauren was applauding politely when she noticed unusual activity among the event organizers, hushed conversations, and meaningful glances that suggested something unplanned was about to happen. Marco rose from his seat beside her with the kind of purposeful movement that indicated serious intention rather than casual networking. He moved toward the podium with confident strides while Lauren watched with growing confusion, wondering if he'd been asked to make an impromptu speech about the firm's charitable contributions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marco said as he reached the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the excellent sound system. "I hope you'll indulge me for a moment while I address something more important than our fundraising goals tonight." Lauren felt her breath stop as Marco's attention focused entirely on her across the crowded ballroom, his green eyes holding an intensity that made conversations around them gradually fade into expectant silence. 6 months ago in this very room, I publicly acknowledged the woman who had made my professional success possible, Marco continued, his voice warm with genuine emotion. Tonight, I want to acknowledge the woman who has made my personal happiness inevitable. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation as attendees realized they were witnessing something far more intimate than a business speech. Lauren sat frozen in her chair, certain she was misunderstanding the situation, but unable to ignore the way Marco was looking at her with an expression that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Lauren Castellano transformed my life the moment she walked into my office, though it took me months to understand what was happening, Marco said, moving away from the podium to walk directly toward her table. She showed me that extraordinary love was possible with the right person, that partnership could be both professional and personal, and that sometimes the most precious gifts come disguised as ordinary moments. Lauren's hands trembled as Marco approached her table, reaching into his jacket pocket while maintaining eye contact that felt more intimate than any touch they'd shared. The elegant crowd around them seemed to disappear as he stopped beside her chair, his presence commanding her complete attention. "Lauren, you taught me that true worth has nothing to do with social status or inherited privilege," Marco said, his voice softening to something meant only for her despite the hundreds of people listening. "You showed me that intelligence and kindness and authentic grace are more valuable than any designer gown or family connection. You made me believe in myself by believing in us." Time seemed suspended as Marco dropped to one knee beside her chair, producing a ring box that caught the ballroom's crystal lighting like captured starlight. The collective gasp from the audience registered dimly in Lauren's awareness, but her entire world had narrowed to Marco's face and the overwhelming love in his expression. "Marry me, Lauren," Marco said simply, opening the box to reveal a vintage emerald surrounded by diamonds that somehow managed to be both spectacular and tastefully elegant. "Be my partner in everything, my companion for life, and the woman who makes every day worth celebrating. Choose me forever, as I choose you." Lauren felt tears spill down her cheeks as the full magnitude of the moment registered. The man she'd once believed was completely beyond her reach was proposing marriage in front of Manhattan's legal establishment, making their commitment as public and permanent as possible while declaring her worth to everyone who had ever underestimated her. Yes, Lauren whispered, then found her voice as joy overwhelmed her careful control. Yes, Marco. Forever yes. The ballroom erupted in enthusiastic applause as Marco slipped the perfect ring onto her trembling finger, then rose to kiss her with tender reverence that made several society matrons dab at their eyes with expensive handkerchiefs. Lauren felt weightless as his arms came around her, lifting her slightly, as if she was precious beyond measure. For those of you wondering if workplace romances ever succeed, Marco said into the microphone after they'd managed to separate enough to acknowledge their audience, I can definitively state that sometimes the right person has been in front of you all along, waiting for you to develop enough sense to recognize extraordinary when you see it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and champagne toasts, with various dignitaries approaching their table to offer best wishes and share stories about successful partnerships between powerful men and remarkable women. Lauren felt surreal as she accepted embraces from Supreme Court justices and senators, all of whom seemed genuinely pleased by Marco's obvious happiness and her transformation from invisible assistant to cherished partner. Wedding planning over the following months revealed the depth of their partnership as they navigated decisions about venues and guest lists with the same collaborative approach they brought to complex legal negotiations. Marco insisted on including Lauren's extended family despite the potential clash between her father's restaurant colleagues and his mother's society connections, determined that their wedding should represent the blending of their worlds rather than the dominance of his. Lauren chose a dress that felt authentically beautiful rather than desperately impressive, selecting classic elegance over dramatic fashion statements that would have felt like costumes on her transformed but still fundamentally genuine personality. Marco's input was surprisingly thoughtful, understanding that she needed to feel like herself rather than trying to become someone else entirely. The ceremony took place in the same small church where Marco's grandparents had been married, with flowers from Sophia's garden and music from Lauren's childhood parish. The guest list included Supreme Court justices and her father's delivery drivers, federal senators, and her college roommates, creating exactly the kind of authentic celebration that reflected their journey from different worlds to shared partnership. Have you ever experienced that moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself turns out to be completely wrong, but in the most beautiful way possible? Standing at the altar in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, watching Marco's face as she walked toward their future together, Lauren reflected on the miraculous distance between the invisible woman who had once believed herself unworthy of notice and the confident bride who knew herself to be cherished beyond measure. Their vows reflected the honesty that had become fundamental to their relationship, acknowledging the unlikely circumstances of their meeting while focusing on the genuine partnership they built together through professional collaboration and personal discovery. Marco spoke about finding his home in her smile and his purpose in protecting her happiness, while Lauren promised to continue believing in their love even when old insecurities whispered that extraordinary things didn't happen to ordinary people. I was wrong about everything, Lauren said as they exchanged rings in front of their combined families and friends. I thought I was invisible, insignificant, unworthy of extraordinary love. You taught me that worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, that love isn't earned through perfection, and that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with someone seeing potential we didn't know we possessed. As they sealed their vows with a kiss that felt like the beginning of forever, Lauren marveled at the journey that had brought them from professional distance to personal intimacy, from her crushing insecurity to absolute certainty about their shared future. The reception celebration continued late into the evening, with dancing and laughter that reflected the joy of two people who had found their perfect partnership despite every reason to believe such happiness was impossible. Lauren's father danced with Sophia while discussing family recipes, and Marco's business associates mingled easily with Lauren's college friends, creating exactly the kind of authentic community they both wanted to build together. Later, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon in Tuscany, where Marco would meet the extended family that had shaped Lauren's understanding of love and loyalty, Lauren caught her reflection in the hotel's elegant mirrors and smiled at the confident woman looking back at her. She was no longer invisible, no longer convinced she was lucky to accept whatever attention might fall her way. She was Lauren Santangelo now, beloved wife of an extraordinary man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, professional partner in building something meaningful together, and absolutely certain that love could indeed transform everything when it was genuine and mutual and built on the foundation of true partnership. Ready for our next adventure, Mrs. Santangelo? Marco asked as he helped her into their car, his voice warm with the happiness that had become their constant companion. Forever ready, Lauren replied, settling into his arms with perfect confidence that wherever they went together, she would never again doubt her place in his world or her worth in his heart. She was finally, completely, and eternally chosen.